Hey everybody, Shoebox Legends here. Thanks for joining me today for a video response episode here on the channel. This is going to be a VR for my buddy Doug over at dkahn. I will leave a link below in the event that you've not linked up with Doug or gotten to know him in the community, but awesome guy. It's really funny how the YouTube and awesome how the YouTube community works. But it's just like this amazing big web of great people, and the more people that I get introduced to, the more awesome people that I meet in turn. And so got friendly with Ken from Ken's Cardboard a little while back, and then through him and his channel learned about Dylan over at Double D Vintage Baseball Cards, and then through Dylan and his channel linked up with Doug over at dkahn, and so on and so forth, along it goes. And so Doug is an awesome guy. I've gotten to know him a little bit better in recent weeks, and definitely consider him a friend in the hobby. I love his take. He also offers really good investment advice on his channel for those of us that want to strike it rich in this hobby of ours. So we're currently working on a scheme to corner the market on all Lars Nootbaar cards. So there's a hot tip. You may want to get some of those now, because once Doug and I lock them all up, there's really not going to be any more to go around. So get your Lars Nootbaar while you can. But let's get into the VR. And what Doug wants to see is kind of like your origin story, I guess, in the hobby, or a card or cards that you remember as kind of being the catalyst to springboarding you into the hobby. And I have kind of a two-part answer to this. I've probably gone over both before, but it's been a while. The first is this binder here, and it's a little bit of a struggle to fit this on camera, but this is my first ever card binder from the winter of 1989. So going back, well over 30 years now. My brothers and I had two younger brothers, and we were playing youth hockey, ice hockey in our area that winter. And my dad thought it was a good idea to get us some hockey cards and get us immersed into the hobby. So he worked at the time as a computer programmer for like a pharmaceutical company, and he had access to these computer manuals that would come in these 3-ring binders. And so he was able to get his hands on some old ones, recycle the manual, and then repurpose these binders for my brothers and I. He made us these custom covers that were inserted on the front on our home computer and printer at the time. So you got Shane's Hockey Cards 1990 here, right in the front. So this would have been really the spring of 90, maybe like January or February by the time we got the binder together. And he would buy my brothers and I, sometimes on his way home from work, he'd stop by the hobby shop and he'd buy us packs of the 89-90 Topps and O-Pee-Chee hockey release. And we would sit around the kitchen table and trade cards, read the card backs. Obviously in the late 80s, early 90s, the internet was just kind of gaining steam, and it wasn't available in most people's homes, and didn't have the kind of resources at your fingertips that you do today. And so the backs of these cards were an excellent way to learn about the sport and to learn about these players. And I just have a lot of good memories of sitting around the kitchen table at my parents' old house with my brothers and I, and our binder spread out and our piles of doubles, and joking about the names and laughing, trading cards, sorting them into our binders, and so on and so forth. And that was my first immersion into the hobby way back over 30 years ago. At the time, I would sort these by team and then by player alphabetically. So the B for Blackhawks, they're the first team in the binder. B for St. Louis Blues, they're the second team in the binder. And then within each team, I would organize my players alphabetically by last name. So, Benning, Cavallini, Herkick, McLean, Millen, Ronning, and so on and so forth. So that's how I organized my binder. Probably some early signs there of, minor particularities or OCD or whatever you want to call it. Certainly not making light of that condition at all, but just I liked organization from an early age. And so these are my original cards. This is what got me into the hobby as a kid. Still love the hobby to this day, coming up on 35, 40 years later, before long here. And yeah, those are the ones. So that's my origin story for the hobby in general. But, knowing that Doug is more of a baseball guy than a hockey guy, and knowing that he's more a vintage guy than a modern guy, although he does have some great modern cards as well, wanted to also show kind of a card that resembles my entrance into the vintage card market, or the vintage side of the hobby. And that is this card right here, which I've also talked about, I think, in the distant past here on the channel, but this is the 1950 Bowman Maurice McDermott. And this was the first vintage card that I ever owned in my life. Probably not long after I got this hockey binder going. In the spring of 90, we moved into collecting baseball cards as well, which is why 1990 Topps Baseball is a favorite set of mine to this day. But I remember on a Saturday, took a trip to a local antique store with my dad and brothers, and we're browsing around in there and saw a little wooden box that was full of early 50s Bowman Commons. And to me, as I was probably maybe an 8-year-old at the time, it was like enough to make my head explode. It was just so cool to see something that old. I didn't know anything about any of the players, who was good back then, the history of the game, really just wetting my feet. But I knew that I loved the look of these and just the history behind them. My dad told me that I could pick out any one that I wanted from the box, and I chose the 1950 Bowman Maurice McDermott, probably because it's a Red Sox card, and growing up in New England, they were the local team. I had been to Fenway to take in a game, prior to this, so I think I chose this just really based on the Red Sox team being on the card. But my dad and I still joke to this day about the back, which refers to Maurice as String Bean Maury in the beginning of the summary there. So we still kind of kid about that to this day, String Bean McDermott, and picking up this card. Shortly after that, did return to that antique store and grabbed a couple of 1952 Bowmans out of that same bin, which were kind of my second and third vintage cards. And I guess, a lot of this explains my love of early 50s Bowman that continues to this day. But before those 52s, this was the one. For at least a week or two, this was the first vintage card in my collection. This kind of whet my palate for vintage, whet my appetite, I should say, and haven't looked back since, other than a little brief break getting settled into adulthood after college and getting a home and getting married. But after getting settled, kind of returned right to it, and certainly have no regrets. I love this hobby. I love all the cool people in it that I'm meeting, it seems like on a weekly basis. Doug, you are certainly one of them, and I hope that this kind of satisfied the requirements of your VR. Really appreciate you putting this on and everything that you bring to the hobby and to this community. So huge thanks to Doug. Please head over and check out dkahn if you haven't. Still time to get in on his contest and do one of these VRs yourself. And it's a great excuse to introduce yourself to Doug and meet another friendly collector. So thank you, Doug, and thank you to everybody else who stopped by to check this out. Really appreciate it, and we'll be back in the very near future with some more sports card content. Until then, take care and enjoy the hobby.